If there are no further points of order, we come now to the 10-minute rule motion. Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in the bill to re-establish the Secretary of State's legal duty as to the National Health Service in England, and to make provision about the other duties of the Secretary of State in that regard, to make provision about the administration and accountability of the National Health Service in England, to repeal Section 1 of the National Health Service Private Finance Act 1997 and Sections 38 and 39 of the Immigration Act 2014 and Part 9 of the Health and Social Care Information Act 2012, to make provision about the application of international law in relation to the health services in the United Kingdom and for connected purposes. It is a privilege to have the opportunity to present this bill to the House of Commons, and I would like to pay tribute to the many patients, nurses, doctors, trade unions and campaigners right across the country who have been working tirelessly to combat the privatisation of our National Health Service. I would also like to pay tribute to the work done by my right honourable friend, the member for York Central, and to that done by the member for Brighton Pavilion on this matter. The bill seeks to fully restore the NHS as an accountable public service by reversing marketisation in the NHS, abolishing the purchase of provider split, ending contracting and re-establishing public bodies and public services making public services accountable to local communities. The Health and Social Care Act 2012 provided the framework for the privatisation of the National Health Service, and we are seeing that privatisation happen at pace. Yes. There are, I believe, three core changes that Act brought in that are driving this privatisation. Firstly, the removal of the Secretary of State for Health's legal duty to provide and secure a comprehensive National Health Service in England. Secondly, the requirement to put NHS contracts out to competitive tender in the free market, putting the profit motive at the heart of the service. And thirdly, allowing NHS hospitals to make up to 49% of their money out of private patients. This bill makes the case for a planned, managed health service and reinstates the duty of the Secretary of State for Health to provide a secure a comprehensive National Health Service, which was lost under the 2012 Act. This is important because under current arrangements, clinical commissioning groups don't actually have to serve a particular geographic area, nor are they required to tend to all illnesses and conditions. In some areas, there is already rationing of certain treatments, such as hip and knee replacements and cataract operations. Reinstating the duty of the Secretary of State for Health is vital to the government's accountability that is needed if we are to continue to have a comprehensive National Health Service. The Health and Social Care Act forces NHS contracts out to competitive tender in the marketplace, allowing private companies to cherry-pick those NHS services that they can make money from. Since 2012, we've seen the effect of NHS contracts going to private companies, undermining NHS services, undermining the paying conditions of staff and fragmenting the service. The sums of money involved are eye-watering. The government would have us believe that only 6% of contracts go to private firms. However, according to the NHS Support Federation, private firms won 36.8% of contracts in the 2014-15 year, securing 3.54 billion of the 9.628 billion deals awarded. Does this matter? Well, I would say yes, absolutely, without question. We know that contracting out is very expensive. In the USA, this cost accounts for around 30% of healthcare expenditure, compared to 5% in the non-marketised NHS pre-1990. Any private company has a duty to generate profit for shareholders, but the money we pay in our taxes should be spent on patient care and should not be going to those shareholders. Yeah. We know that putting healthcare contracts out to competitive tender means money spent on marketing, on contact lawyers, which could be spent on patients.
Yes.
We know too that a proliferation of providers means a proliferation of administrative costs, and that it also opens up opportunities for fraud. The only way the private sector can reduce costs is by ultimately cutting quality. This might happen through a number of means: cutting the pay and terms and conditions of health service staff, or selling off of nationally owned assets. As a nation, I believe we hold our doctors, nurses and other NHS staff in high esteem. It's important we protect their pay and conditions. This bill includes a requirement for the use of national terms and conditions of employment for relevant NHS staff under the NHS Staff Council and Agenda for Change system. And the bill includes provisions which aim to prevent the application of competition law and procurement rules to the NHS. It would abolish Monitor, the sector regulator that licenses health service providers and oversees the operation of procurement, choice and competition rules in the health service. And it would repeal sections of the 2012 Act relating to procurement, competition, tariff pricing and health special administration. And now I'd like to consider the 49%. NHS hospitals are now allowed to make up to 49% of their money from private patients because of that 2012 Act. How they make their 49% of money is up to them. The startling fact is that they can do it. They can choose to devote 49% of beds to private patients, 49% of theatre time to private patients, 49% of consultants' time to private patients. And absolutely nobody voted for that. It was in neither the Conservative Party nor the Liberal Democrat Party's manifesto, and yet they went ahead and passed the legislation to make that happen. I believe this is nothing short of a national scandal, and I would ask honourable members to reflect on what it would mean for their constituents if their hospital were to choose to do this. How soon would this happen? Well, in some places it's happening already. The Royal Marsden Hospital, for example, now makes 26% of its money out of private patients. That's over a quarter. And so I turn to the NHS financial crisis, something which we are all well aware of and is particularly notable in our hospitals. And we also know too that the financial crisis is accelerating at a frightening pace. NHS trusts in England have recorded a deficit of 2.45 billion for 2015-16. The biggest overspend in the history of the National Health Service, and nearly 3 times the size of the overspend of the preceding year, and more than 20 times the size of the 2013-14 deficit. 3 in 4 of our hospitals are predicting that they will be in deficit this year. And we know too that financial crisis is impacting on delivery of care. It's not difficult to see how hospital managers may feel in these circumstances that increasing the amount of private patients the NHS hospitals treat to generate more incomes is one of the few options open to them. And then we can look at the recent arrival of STPs. These are Sustainability Transformation Plans. If we look at this, we can see the bigger picture. England has been divided into 44 areas, each of which is required to come up with an STP. The first priority of the STP is that CCGs and providers must cut expenditure and stay within budgets for 2016-17 and continue to do so for the next 4 years to be entitled to access centrally controlled transformation funding. And so they will face some tough choices. They could sell assets, they could cut services, they could ration services, and they could actually charge for services. In this landscape, we can expect to see hospitals taking private patients to generate extra cash, putting NHS patients to the back of the queue. Now, doubtless the government would argue that the hospitals will be able to reinvest the money earned from private patients. I would say this argument does not stack up. If you cut 49% of resource from NHS patients, then waiting times will grow and we will see the quality of service decline. We will see the emergence of a 2-tier health service. First rate for those with the money to pay, NHS patients receiving a much diminished service. The concept of a comprehensive service, free at the point of use, will be lost within a generation. And we will all be facing the very real possibility of having to buy health insurance, just as people do in America. Let's remind ourselves, these hospitals are ours. They've been paid for out of our taxes and they're run by our NHS. They are not the government's to give away. This bill addresses this and will remove the right of NHS hospitals to make that 49% out of private patients. I believe we won't be able to manage our NHS properly until we address the issue of social care, and we are all very aware of how important that is. Why should we settle for an NHS that is free to all who need it, unless they are elderly or have complex needs? This bill provides us with an opportunity to change that, giving the Secretary of State a duty to exercise his functions with a view to integrating the provision of health and social care services. This integration of health and social care was a key aim of the Right Honourable Member for Lee when he was Shadow Secretary of State for Health in the last Parliament, and formed part of the Labour Party manifesto. I believe that it's a development that would be welcomed by families up and down the country. The bill would also provide for the transfer of financial obligations under NHS PFI agreements to the Treasury, which would also be required to assess and publish their obligations. It would improve public health, and it would, in effect, to sum up, stop the privatisation of the NHS and return it to its founding principles. It would remove competition and the profit motor as a driver of policy and replace them with the public service ethos that has been the hallmark of the NHS since its foundation. The NHS is currently on life support, and the public patients and NHS staff know it. This bill provides a viable alternative. The NHS was 68 years old last week. We need to make sure it's there for all who need it in the next 68 years too. Yeah.
Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. Mr. Philip Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to oppose this bill. The whole bill, Mr. Speaker, is based on a false premise. The Honourable Lady said that the bill is necessary to stop the privatisation of the NHS. Well, the privatisation of the NHS is not occurring, Mr. Speaker, and so by her own words, this bill is completely unnecessary. In fact, she might have actually gone a bit further, particularly with people on this side of the House, if she'd actually she was laying the blame of the so-called privatisation of the NHS on the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, and thinks that repealing the Health and Social Care Act of 2012 would therefore solve the problem of the, as she describes it, the privatisation of the NHS. The Honourable Lady, who doesn't seem able to be bothered to listen to the debate, even though it's her bill, the Honourable Lady might have actually acknowledged that the so-called privatisation of the NHS was starting long before the Health and Social Care Act of 2012. In fact, it's actually gathered pace. Mr. Speaker, during the last Labour government. And if we look at the figures for the expenditure on private providers, what we will actually see is that from a near standing start under the Labour government, the amount of the total NHS resource expenditure, which actually went to private providers, grew much more rapidly under the last Labour government than it actually has under this government. The actual increase of NHS resources going to private providers actually slowed down under this government. The rate of increase is now much lower than it was. So it was actually her Labour government that actually introduced the private sector into the NHS and allowed private sector providers to provide treatment on the NHS. And that, Mr. Speaker, is something that I welcome as it happens. I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as a good thing. My constituents, who normally with the NHS, if they need some hospital treatment, have to go to either Bradford Royal Infirmary, which is not in my constituency, it's in the constituency of the Honourable Member for Bradford West, or they have to go to Airedale Hospital, which is in the constituency of my honourable friend for Keighley. Under the current provisions whereby the NHS can actually allow private providers to supply these services, my constituents can now go to the Yorkshire Clinic in my constituency to have very high quality treatment. It's served to them much closer to their homes, and it is still free at the point of need. And as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker, the essential founding principle of the NHS that must be preserved is that treatment is free at the point of need. That's really what matters to people. What people want when they need healthcare treatment is they want free healthcare at the point of need and high quality healthcare at a very convenient location for them, perhaps for their family members to visit. Whether or not that's carried out at an NHS hospital or a private hospital, in that sense, is neither here nor there, as long as they're getting the treatment free of charge at the point of need. And my constituents are greatly benefiting from this by being able to have that treatment at the Yorkshire Clinic rather than having to go to one of the NHS hospitals outside of my constituency. But of course, the last Labour government, Mr. Speaker, were actually far worse when it came to giving contracts out to the private sector. Because those of us who were here at the time will know that they didn't pay the same tariff. The Honourable Lady for Oldham keeps chirping away from the front bench. If she listens, she might learn something. Well, she will do, and other honourable members may well do as well, because what happened, many of those who weren't here at the time, but those of us who were here at the time, Mr. Speaker, will recall.
Order. The honourable member for Shipley is exercising his democratic rights as a parliamentarian, and the honourable gentleman must be heard, and preferably with courtesy, but certainly without noise. Mr. Philip Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. The point I was making is that when the Labour Party used to give out contracts to the private sector, they actually paid the private providers more, a higher tariff, for carrying out that work than they actually paid to NHS hospitals and NHS providers. which to my mind was a complete outrage. They're so against the private sector. Why on earth were they paying those private providers a higher tariff than they were the NHS providers? It was this government that actually stopped that absolutely absurd practice and made sure that private providers were now only paid the same tariff as NHS providers. Perhaps the Honourable Lady might have mentioned that in her remarks, but again, failed to do so. So the whole bill, Mr. Speaker, is based on a false premise. It was the last Labour government that introduced the private sector into the NHS. It was the last Labour government that actually it paid private providers more for carrying out the same work than for NHS patients. And it's this government that has actually seen that increase slow down and actually dealt with those absurdities. The other thing I want to point out before we go any further, Mr. Speaker, is about the other part of this bill, which the Honourable Lady was pretty quiet on, which was about the Section 38 of the Immigration Act 2014 that she wishes to repeal. This actually provides for nationals from outside of the EEA who come to the UK for longer than 6 months, requires them to pay a health surcharge when making their immigration application. And although there are no statistics available yet on the revenue raised from this surcharge, a parliamentary question last year showed that the government estimated it would recover around £200 million a year from it from foreign nationals using the NHS. The Honourable Lady in this bill wishes to repeal that legislation. In effect, she wants foreign nationals to come into the UK and use the NHS free of charge. No wonder she mentioned so little of it in her speech. Now, she was the one who, at the end of her speech, talked about the financial crisis being suffered by the NHS. And she's now bringing forward a bill which will actually stop the NHS being able to recover some of this money that is spent on foreign nationals, treating them in the NHS. The whole bill, Mr. Speaker, is a complete absurdity and it's a complete nonsense. And if she was so proud of this particular provision in the bill, why did she not mention it during her speech? Maybe she secretly is embarrassed about it as well. Maybe she knows that her constituents wouldn't particularly appreciate the fact that she's trying to pass legislation in this House to actually give free treatment to foreign nationals, actually costing the NHS more money, not saving the NHS money. Now, I know that she's one of the last remaining supporters of the Leader of the Opposition, but I'm sure even he might think that that's a rather strange thing for her to be doing to try and help the financial situation of the NHS. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, I know this is the same bill that the Honourable Lady from the Green Party in Brighton brought forward in the last session of Parliament. Maybe the Honourable Lady from Wirral West didn't actually read the bill and just brought it forward without looking at it and didn't realise it brought forward that particular provision. But either it was an omission on her part, or it's a rather strange absurdity that she wants to bring forward legislation to take around £200 million a year at least off the NHS. How that helps to save the NHS is the one that she might be able to discuss. I really can't see the logic in it. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't intend to stop her having her moment in the sun and bringing forward her bill. I just wanted to point out that the whole bill is based on a false premise. It was the last Labour government that introduced the private sector into the NHS, not this government. And no matter how many times she wants to try and repeat that particular myth, it won't get off the ground. And her bill will actually cost the NHS more money. It won't save the NHS any money. And on that basis, when it does come forward to the House, I shall be here, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Caroline Lucas, Dawn Butler, Stella Creasy, Nick Dakin, Peter Dowd, Mike Kane, Liz McInnes, Yasmin Qureshi, Mary Rimmer, Stephen Twigg, John Pugh and myself, Mr. Speaker.
Margaret Greenwood.
National Health Service Bill.
Second reading what day?
4th of November 2016.
4th of November 2016. Thank you. Order. Motion number